The summer of 1992 should have been a season of celebration in the quiet city of Springfield, Missouri. High school graduations had just wrapped up, young people were planning their futures, and families were preparing for vacations. On June 6, 3 women, a mother, her daughter, and the daughter's best friend, vanished without a trace from a modest suburban home. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no clear evidence of what happened. It was as if the house itself had swallowed them whole. This is the story of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. A case that has puzzled law enforcement for decades, captured the imagination of journalists, and left a community forever marked by the absence of 3 ordinary women. To understand the impact of what happened, we first need to step back into the atmosphere of Springfield in the early 1990s. It was a mid-sized city, nestled in the heart of the Ozarks, known for its strong sense of community and the kind of everyday routines you'd expect from a place far removed from the violence of larger cities. Families left their doors unlocked. Children played freely in front yards. It was a place where people felt safe. But the disappearance shattered that sense of security. It was more than just a case of missing persons. It became a story about how fear can creep into even the most ordinary corners of life. On the evening of June 6, 1992, 2 friends, Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall, had just graduated from Kickapoo High School. They spent the day celebrating with classmates, moving from one party to the next. Eventually, they decided to spend the night at Suzie's house. Her mother, Sherrill Levitt, was already home, winding down after a long day. Seemed like an ordinary decision. Safer, quieter, and closer than driving all the way to another friend's home. At around 2 in the morning, the girls left a gathering and made their way to the Levitt residence. They arrived sometime after. What happened next is a blank space in history. By the next morning, all 3 women, Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy, were gone. The house itself provided the first set of mysteries. Friends who came to check on the women noticed that all 3 cars were still parked outside. The family dog was inside the home, unharmed but visibly distressed. Personal belongings, including purses and keys, were left behind. Makeup, clothing, cigarettes, all the things one might take when leaving voluntarily, remained untouched. The only unusual detail was a shattered globe on the front porch light. A minor detail perhaps, but in a case with no clear clues, even the smallest anomalies became points of endless speculation. To the friends and family who first walked into the home, the atmosphere was chilling. It looked as though the 3 women had simply vanished into thin air, in the middle of the night, without warning. As word of their disappearance spread, Springfield transformed overnight. Parents who had once felt secure began double-locking their doors. Teenagers who had once walked home at night suddenly asked for rides. In a matter of hours, the community shifted from celebration to fear. What had begun as a hopeful summer now felt like a season of dread. Police were called to the scene later that day. What they found confirmed the disturbing impression. There was no sign of forced entry, no signs of a violent struggle, and no indication of where the women could have gone. If this was foul play, it was executed with precision and silence. If it was something else, no one could imagine what. From the beginning, investigators faced an uphill battle. The initial hours of any missing persons case are the most critical, but in this situation, valuable time had already slipped away. Friends had entered the home before authorities arrived, unintentionally disturbing what might have been key evidence. Items had been moved, the floors had been walked on, and phone messages had been deleted in attempts to help. No one knew they were stepping into what would become one of the most perplexing crime scenes in American history. But in 1992, few could have predicted the long shadow this case would cast. To neighbors and relatives, it seemed obvious that the women had been taken against their will. Yet the absence of evidence left everyone clinging to their own theories. Had they been abducted by someone they trusted? Did they leave the house willingly, only for something to go horribly wrong afterward? Or was it something far more elaborate, a carefully planned act that left no trace behind? The early hours of the investigation raised more questions than answers. The vehicles remained untouched. The purses contained money, identification, and essentials. If the women had left voluntarily, why abandon everything they would need for even a short trip? And then there was the telephone call. Friends who entered the home later reported receiving strange, harassing calls while they were there. Calls that made them uneasy but were not immediately recognized as evidence. By the time investigators learned of them, the details were fuzzy and the opportunity to trace them had passed. The sheer lack of physical evidence was overwhelming. No fingerprints out of place. No blood, no clear sign of a struggle, nothing stolen. To detectives, it was as though someone had managed to remove 3 people from a home without leaving behind a single usable trace. That very absence became the heart of the case. For the families, the pain was immediate and unbearable. For Sherrill's relatives, the idea of a mother vanishing with her daughter and her daughter's best friend was inconceivable. For Stacy's parents, the nightmare was compounded by the fact that she had simply gone over to spend the night at a friend's house, something any teenager might do. Their worlds had changed in a single night. News of the disappearance spread quickly, first throughout Springfield and then across the nation. Missing person posters were printed, distributed, and plastered on walls, telephone poles, and store windows. Police held press conferences, appealing to the public for any information, no matter how small. Volunteers joined search parties, combing wooded areas, rivers, and abandoned properties in the hope of finding even a single clue. But as hours turned into days and days into weeks, the mystery deepened. Every lead seemed to fade into dead ends. Rumors swirled, theories multiplied, but the truth remained locked behind silence. And so began what would become one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking investigations in modern true crime history. The case of the 3 missing women wasn't just about their disappearance. It was about the community that suddenly realized the fragility of safety. Springfield was forced to confront questions it had never asked before. If 3 women could vanish without a trace in the middle of the night, who was safe? If a crime could occur in a home without signs of violence, what did that mean for everyone else who believed their doors and locks could keep danger out? This was the atmosphere in which the investigation unfolded, a blend of urgency, confusion, and fear. And as police struggled to make sense of the vanishing, the case began to take on a life of its own, drawing in the media, captivating the public, and eventually becoming one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. By the morning of June 7, 1992, concern for the 3 women began to grow rapidly. What was supposed to be a typical summer Sunday was instead filled with unanswered phone calls, uneasy glances, and an escalating sense of dread. Friends who expected to see Suzie and Stacy for a planned trip to a nearby water park quickly realized something was wrong when the girls failed to show. At first, their absence seemed unusual but not alarming. Teenagers sometimes overslept or changed plans without notice. But as the morning stretched on, calls to the Levitt home went unanswered. Soon, friends decided to stop by the house to check in. That decision marked the beginning of a chain of events that would forever shape the investigation. When they arrived, the scene was odd but not immediately alarming. The cars belonging to all 3 women were parked outside. Nothing seemed visibly wrong. The house was quiet, the front door unlocked. Stepping inside, friends found the family dog, a small, fluffy pup named Cinnamon, uneasy but unharmed. The dog's distress was noticeable, as if it had been left alone far longer than usual. Looking around, the friends saw the women's belongings still in the home. Susie's jewelry, her purse, Stacy's things, and Sherrill's cigarettes, all untouched. Makeup and clothes were laid out, suggesting that whatever happened occurred after the women had already settled in for the night. The only clear disruption was the shattered glass globe of the porch light. Though it could have been the result of an accident, in the context of the disappearance, it stood out as a chilling anomaly. Some speculated it was broken intentionally, perhaps to darken the porch and conceal activity from the street. Others thought it could have been a simple accident with no connection at all. At first, those who entered the house tried to make sense of the situation themselves. They tidied up small things, hoping the women would return at any moment. Some even answered the phone. It was then that a strange detail emerged. Calls came in from an unknown source, described later as disturbing or harassing in nature. Exactly what was said remains unclear, but the friends dismissed them at the time, never realizing they might have been vital pieces of evidence. By the time law enforcement was finally called, the house had been walked through, touched, and partially cleaned. Evidence, if it had ever been there, was now compromised. Investigators later admitted that the first few hours of the case, critical to any missing person search, had been lost. When Springfield police arrived, they were immediately struck by the eeriness of the scene. The women were gone, yet everything else remained as if frozen in place. Nothing suggested a voluntary disappearance, yet nothing suggested violence either. To detectives, the absence of clues was as startling as any evidence of a crime could have been. The investigation began in earnest. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with anyone who might have seen or heard something in the late night or early morning hours. But no neighbors recalled unusual activity, no suspicious vehicles, no shouts or noises. It was as though the night had passed in complete silence. Within hours, the missing persons case became front-page news across Missouri. Television crews gathered outside the home, reporting live as police carried out their first searches. The sight of flashing police lights and crime scene tape in such a familiar, ordinary neighborhood unsettled the community. For Springfield residents, the story struck too close to home. Parents who had spent the night celebrating their children's graduations now found themselves sitting their kids down for serious conversations about safety. Teenagers who had planned carefree summer outings suddenly thought twice about where they went and with whom. The disappearance of Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy was no longer just a police matter. It was a community crisis. Authorities pursued multiple avenues in the initial days. Search parties were organized, covering wooded areas, fields, and nearby waterways. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through grasslands, hoping to stumble across any sign of the women. Police helicopters scanned from above, while boats scoured lakes and rivers. Every barn, abandoned building, and remote dirt road became a potential clue. Tips poured in from across the region. Some reported seeing women who matched the description at convenience stores or along highways. Others claimed to overhear suspicious conversations in diners or bars. Each lead was followed diligently, yet none provided answers. The families, meanwhile, became unwilling participants in a nightmare. Sherrill's relatives could not believe she would ever leave without contacting someone. Suzie's brother, deeply shaken, worked tirelessly to spread awareness. Stacy's parents, devastated, described their daughter as a responsible and grounded young woman, the last person to disappear without explanation. As days turned into weeks, their grief mixed with determination. They handed out flyers, stood in front of cameras, and pleaded with the public for information. Each press conference was filled with raw emotion, a visible reminder that this was not just a mystery, but a family tragedy. The media coverage quickly amplified the case far beyond Springfield. Newspapers and television stations across the country picked up the story, framing it as one of the most baffling disappearances in recent memory. Headlines emphasized the lack of evidence, describing it as vanishing without a trace. Reporters compared it to other famous mysteries, fueling a nationwide fascination with what became known locally as simply the three missing women. The public reaction was intense. Some speculated about possible suspects. Others pointed to the eerie phone calls, demanding to know why they hadn't been traced. Rumors spread in coffee shops, workplaces, and schools. For Springfield residents, the case became a constant backdrop to daily life. The psychological toll was immense. People began questioning their own safety in ways they never had before. If three women could be taken from a suburban home without anyone noticing, what did that mean for everyone else? Parents no longer assumed their children were safe at sleepovers. Women avoided walking alone at night. Even something as simple as leaving a porch light on became a reminder of the broken globe at the Levitt home. Springfield police worked tirelessly, but progress was slow. They interviewed dozens of people connected to the women, family members, friends, former partners, neighbors, co-workers. They considered every possibility: abduction, foul play, or even an elaborate plan to disappear. Yet every scenario seemed to collapse under the weight of missing evidence. One of the key challenges was the sheer silence of the case. In many missing persons investigations, there are signs, credit card usage, phone records, sightings, or patterns that help piece together the last movements of the victims. Here there was nothing. The women had vanished overnight, leaving the world only with questions. As the first month passed, the case remained unsolved. Search efforts slowed. Leads dried up. Yet the mystery continued to haunt the city. Memorials were held, vigils lit candles, and the faces of Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy became etched into the memory of an entire community. This was only the beginning of what would become one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in American history. And as the summer turned to fall, the investigation would take unexpected turns, drawing in more attention, more theories, and more dead ends. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance of the three women became more than just a local mystery. It became a national story. The faces of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall were broadcast into living rooms across America. Their names appeared in headlines from coast to coast, framed as the Springfield Three. This was no longer just a case for Springfield, Missouri. It was a mystery that tapped into a universal fear, the idea that people could simply vanish without explanation. And as the media spotlight grew brighter, so too did the weight of expectation on the investigators working tirelessly behind the scenes. Television crews camped outside the Levitt home. Every small development was reported as breaking news. If police searched a field, helicopters hovered above, capturing footage. If divers entered a lake, the images were broadcast on the evening news. In a matter of weeks, the modest house on East Delmar Street became one of the most recognizable addresses in America. The coverage fueled the public's imagination. Talk shows debated theories. Newspapers speculated about motives and suspects. True crime magazines picked up the story, each adding their own layer of drama to an already mysterious case. And while this attention kept the case alive, it also added enormous pressure to the Springfield Police Department. For detectives, the attention was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the publicity ensured that no one could ignore the case. Tips poured in from across the nation, some helpful, many not. On the other hand, the sheer volume of information became overwhelming. Every rumor had to be checked, every tip had to be investigated, and every new lead brought with it a wave of hope that too often ended in disappointment. Investigators compared the process to searching for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack itself was constantly growing. For every legitimate tip, there were dozens of false alarms. People who believed they had seen one of the women in another state, strangers who claimed to know details about the crime, and even hoax calls from individuals seeking attention. The community of Springfield struggled under the weight of uncertainty. Residents who once left doors unlocked now double-bolted them. Hardware stores reported increased sales of locks and security systems. Self-defense classes saw rising enrollment. People no longer took safety for granted, because the disappearance had proven how fragile safety could be. The psychological impact was profound. Springfield, once seen as a safe and quiet place to raise a family, now carried a shadow. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. What made the case so frightening was not only the crime itself, but the complete absence of explanation. Without answers, fear had room to grow unchecked. Amid the chaos, the families of the missing women continued to be the most powerful voices. They stood before cameras, their grief visible, their pleas unwavering. They asked for information, for compassion, and above all for answers. Vigils were held in parks and churches. Candles lit the night as hundreds of community members gathered to pray and hope for the safe return of the women. Each vigil became both a symbol of unity and a reminder of loss. For the families, it was a way to keep the story alive, to ensure that the names Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy would not be forgotten. For the community, it was a way to come together in the face of fear, to remind themselves that they were not alone in their grief. Law enforcement threw everything they had into the investigation. The Springfield Police Department, the Greene County Sheriff's Office, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and even the FBI became involved at various points. They combed through phone records, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and pursued every lead, no matter how improbable. Detectives built timelines of the women's last known movements. They reconstructed the night of the graduation parties, retraced the girls' steps, and interviewed every friend, classmate, and acquaintance who had been with them that evening. They spoke to neighbors who might have heard something. They questioned people with criminal histories in the area. But time and again the leads went cold. The frustration grew. Detectives described the case as like chasing shadows. Every clue seemed to evaporate as soon as it was pursued. Every promising lead eventually ended in silence. And as the weeks turned into months, the once hopeful expectation of finding the women alive began to fade. Still, investigators could not give up. They pursued theories, ranging from targeted abduction to random crime. Some believed the women had been taken by someone they knew. Others speculated about a stranger who had been watching, waiting for the right moment. Theories swirled, but evidence remained stubbornly absent. The media, hungry for answers, often highlighted these theories, sometimes blurring the line between fact and speculation. This led to frustration among detectives, who worried that misinformation could hinder the investigation. At times, details released publicly sparked waves of rumors, which investigators then had to untangle. The delicate balance between keeping the public informed and protecting the integrity of the case became one of the greatest challenges. Despite these difficulties, the case never left the spotlight. It captured the imagination of the entire nation because it seemed to defy logic. How could 3 women vanish without a trace? How could a home in a quiet neighborhood become the epicenter of one of the most confounding mysteries in modern times? For the families, the months following the disappearance were marked by endless cycles of hope and heartbreak. Every time a new lead emerged, they clung to it as a possible breakthrough. Every time that lead collapsed, the grief cut deeper. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. In interviews, family members spoke of sleepless nights, of waiting by the phone, of scanning crowds in public places in the faint hope of spotting a familiar face. They spoke of the pain of living in limbo, unable to mourn, yet unable to celebrate a reunion. The not knowing was its own kind of torment. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, Springfield prepared to mark the grim milestone. A year had passed, yet there were still no answers. Memorial services were planned, not as funerals, but as reminders that the women had not been forgotten. Their photographs still appeared in shop windows. Their names still circulated in conversations. The case remained as fresh in the minds of the community as it had been on that first day. But for investigators, the anniversary brought not only reflection, but renewed urgency. Cold cases grow colder with time, and the fear of losing momentum weighed heavily. Detectives redoubled their efforts, reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and considering new angles. They knew the longer the case remained unsolved, the harder it would be to ever find the truth. The Springfield Three had become a symbol of mystery, of fear, and of the fragility of life's certainties. For the city of Springfield, they were not just names in a headline. They were daughters, a mother, friends, and neighbors. And for law enforcement, they were a case that demanded answers, even when none seemed within reach. As the years would show, the story of the Springfield Three was far from over. The investigation would continue, leads would surface, suspects would emerge, and theories would evolve. Yet for all the efforts, the central mystery would remain. What happened on that quiet night in June 1992? As the second year of the investigation began, the case of the 3 missing women entered a painful stage of silence. The immediate urgency that had once filled every headline and newscast slowly began to fade. The cameras moved on, and other news stories took center stage. But for the families, for investigators, and for the community of Springfield, the nightmare had not ended. Every day remained a reminder of absence. The house on East Delmar Street still stood, no longer just a family home but a symbol of unanswered questions. It had become a haunting landmark, a place that neighbors passed with heavy glances, where strangers sometimes stopped to leave flowers or prayers. The ordinary residence was now etched into history as the scene of a mystery with no clear answers. False leads continued to plague investigators. In nearly every state, reports came in of women resembling Suzie or Stacy. A traveler swore they had seen Sherrill in an airport. A clerk claimed 2 of the women had stopped into a gas station hundreds of miles away. Each report carried with it a moment of hope, but as detectives pursued them, the leads inevitably fell apart. Some tips bordered on the bizarre. Psychics offered visions. Letters arrived with cryptic messages. Anonymous callers claimed to know what happened but refused to provide proof. For every credible lead, dozens of misleading ones consumed time and resources. Detectives, exhausted but determined, worked tirelessly, aware that every hour spent chasing a false lead was an hour lost in finding the truth. The silence took its toll on the families most of all. Sherrill's relatives held on to the idea that a mother so devoted to her daughter could not simply vanish forever. Stacy's parents wrestled with guilt, replaying the events of that night over and over, wondering if some different decision might have spared her. Suzie's brother carried the heavy burden of being one of the loudest voices keeping the case in the public eye, all while coping with his own grief. The emotional strain was immense. Families of missing persons often describe the experience as being trapped between 2 worlds, unable to grieve fully, yet unable to hope freely. Every day is marked by uncertainty, and every phone call carries the possibility of life-altering news. For the community of Springfield, the case had become part of its collective identity. People who had lived through the summer of 1992 could not forget it, and newcomers were told the story as a kind of local legend. Parents warned their children. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the 3 who vanished. But over time, frustration grew. Some questioned whether the police had mishandled the early stages of the investigation. Why had the house not been sealed immediately? Why had possible evidence been disturbed? Why hadn't the strange phone calls been traced? The lack of answers bred doubt, and in the absence of clarity, rumors thrived. Conspiracy theories emerged. Some believed the women had been targeted by someone with a personal connection. Others suspected a stranger, a predator who had struck with precision. A few even speculated about organized crime, suggesting the disappearance was part of something larger and more complex. None of these theories had evidence strong enough to stand on their own, but they filled the void left by silence. Police tried to combat misinformation by releasing official statements, but each time they spoke, the public demanded more. Detectives described the case as one of the most challenging they had ever encountered, a mystery with no crime scene, no witnesses, and no definitive evidence. Without these, even the most skilled investigators were left piecing together shadows. For the detectives working the case, the psychological weight was crushing. Many admitted in later interviews that they carried the story of the Springfield Three with them every day. It was the case they could not solve, the case that kept them awake at night, replaying details, wondering if they had missed something obvious. Some described it as a puzzle with missing pieces. They could see fragments of a story, but the full picture remained hidden. Each time they felt close to a breakthrough, the trail went cold. And each year that passed without resolution deepened their determination while also feeding their frustration. The long silence was punctuated occasionally by flares of hope. A new witness would come forward, or a possible suspect would be named. Media outlets would once again focus their cameras on Springfield, reviving public interest. But each time the momentum faded. No arrest was made. No bodies were found. The case remained where it had always been, an open wound with no closure. The families learned to live in this cycle of renewed hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Birthdays passed without celebrations. Holidays arrived with empty chairs at the table. Anniversaries of the disappearance were marked with vigils, candles, and prayers, but no answers. The community itself changed in subtle ways. While life in Springfield returned to routines, an undercurrent of unease lingered. Parents who had once trusted the safety of their neighborhoods never fully relaxed again. The idea that 3 women could vanish from a home without a single witness had permanently altered the city's sense of security. For many, the case became a reminder of vulnerability. Safety, they realized, was not guaranteed, not in Springfield, not anywhere. The story of the 3 missing women became a cautionary tale, passed from one generation to the next. Years turned into decades. By the late 1990s, the case was considered cold. Yet it was never forgotten. The faces of the Springfield Three remained on posters, in newspaper archives, and in the memories of all who had followed the story. Detectives continued to revisit the evidence, hoping new technology might one day provide answers. DNA testing, advances in forensics, and new methods of investigation all held the possibility of breakthroughs. Files were kept open, waiting for the day when science or chance might unlock the truth. And through it all, the families endured. Their grief never faded, though it shifted into something quieter, more private. The public might have moved on to other stories, but for them, every day was still June 7, 1992. Every day was still the day 3 women vanished into the night. The silence, however, would not last forever. In the years to come, suspects would emerge, tips would resurface, and investigators would chase new leads with renewed determination. Each breakthrough would bring the promise of resolution. Each setback would deepen the mystery. The story of the Springfield Three was far from over. In nearly every unsolved mystery, there comes a point when names begin to surface. Suspects, persons of interest, people who may hold the key to what really happened. For the case of the 3 missing women, several names would rise and fall in the years that followed. Each one brought hope, each one carried weight, and each one ultimately left investigators and families still waiting for answers. One of the first figures to draw attention was a man with a criminal history and a reputation for violence. He was questioned early on because of his ties to Springfield and his familiarity with the area. Detectives believed he might have known Suzie or Stacy in passing. Yet when pressed, there was little evidence linking him directly to the disappearance. Like so many others, he became a shadow in the investigation. Possible but unproven. Over time, other names emerged. Former acquaintances, ex-boyfriends, co-workers, and even strangers who had been in the neighborhood that night. Each was interviewed, scrutinized, and sometimes publicly speculated about. But the absence of physical evidence made it nearly impossible to move forward with charges. Suspicion alone was not enough to build a case. Perhaps the most discussed potential suspect was a man already imprisoned for unrelated crimes. He hinted at knowing what had happened to the women, suggesting their bodies had been buried in a remote area. His claims drew massive attention, with media outlets reporting every detail of his statements. Law enforcement investigated his leads thoroughly, searching the locations he described. Yet once again no evidence was found. His story, like so many before it, dissolved under scrutiny. These false leads became part of the tragic rhythm of the case. A suspect would be identified. Families and the community would cling to the possibility of resolution. Investigators would pour resources into checking the claims. And in the end, hope would be replaced by disappointment. Years later, a new theory surfaced, one that suggested the women had been buried beneath a hospital parking garage constructed not long after their disappearance. The idea was shocking, and it spread quickly through media reports and community conversations. The theory gained traction after a mechanical engineer claimed to have used ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete, identifying anomalies that might indicate disturbed soil beneath the structure. The possibility that the remains of the Springfield Three could be hidden in plain sight, beneath a building thousands of people used every day, was both horrifying and compelling. For a time it seemed like the case might finally break open. But after careful review, law enforcement declined to dig up the parking garage, citing a lack of conclusive evidence. The anomalies could be explained by natural soil shifts or construction remnants. Without stronger proof, the risk of tearing apart the structure outweighed the uncertain results. And so, the theory joined the long list of possibilities, haunting but unconfirmed. The mistakes of the early investigation continued to loom over the case. Detectives admitted that the compromised crime scene in the Levitt home had set them back significantly. Potential fingerprints, footprints, or other trace evidence may have been lost forever. The mishandling wasn't intentional. It came from friends and loved ones trying to help, but in hindsight, it had closed doors that might otherwise have led to answers. Technology became both a frustration and a source of renewed hope. In 1992, forensic science was far more limited than it is today. DNA testing, cell phone tracking, and digital forensics were either in their infancy or non-existent. Had the same disappearance occurred decades later, investigators might have had access to tools capable of uncovering vital evidence. Instead, detectives were left with paper files, interviews, and physical searches. Despite these challenges, investigators never gave up. Cold case units revisited the files. New detectives joined the force and inherited the mystery. Each brought fresh eyes, reviewing witness statements, reanalyzing timelines, and reconsidering old theories in the light of new perspectives. Public interest also ensured the case never truly faded. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials revisited the story, introducing it to new generations and reigniting conversations. Each retelling carried the hope that someone, somewhere, might finally come forward with the missing piece of information. The suspects and theories became a web, some plausible, others far-fetched. Some suggested that the women had been abducted by someone passing through Springfield, a predator who struck at random and disappeared before police could react. Others believed it was someone local, someone who knew the women and their routines, and who had planned the act carefully. One enduring question was whether the three women had been the intended targets, or if circumstances had simply placed them in danger that night. Was Sherrill collateral in a crime aimed at her daughter? Was Stacy merely in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or had all three been deliberately chosen? Without evidence, every scenario remained speculation. Law enforcement also explored connections to other crimes in Missouri and beyond. Could the Springfield Three have been victims of a serial offender? Were their disappearances linked to other unsolved cases? Each possibility was examined, but no definitive connections were found. The case became an example in law enforcement training programs, a cautionary tale of how quickly critical evidence can be lost, and how even the most dedicated investigation can be hampered by silence. It highlighted the importance of immediate response, preservation of crime scenes, and the integration of emerging technologies. For the families, the parade of suspects and theories was emotionally exhausting. Each new development meant reopening wounds, reliving the night of the disappearance, and bracing themselves for answers that never came. They attended press conferences, spoke at vigils, and reminded the public that behind the theories and headlines were real people, loved ones whose absence was felt every single day. Suzie's brother, in particular, became a tireless advocate. He kept his sister's name alive in the media, pushing for new coverage, new attention, and new efforts from law enforcement. His determination ensured that the Springfield Three would not simply be forgotten in the endless sea of unsolved cases. As the 2000s unfolded, advances in forensic science provided a glimmer of hope. DNA databases grew, new tools for analyzing evidence were developed, and the possibility of revisiting old materials with fresh technology became real. Yet even with these advances, the case remained stubbornly unsolved. Every time investigators revisited the evidence, they faced the same problem: the lack of physical clues. Without bodies, without clear forensic samples, and without eyewitnesses, the case remained an enigma. It was as though the three women had been erased from the timeline, leaving behind only questions. The suspects who once seemed promising eventually faded into the background, their names remembered in whispers but never proven guilty. Theories about burial sites, random predators, or calculated plans lingered but never solidified. The Springfield Three remained missing, and Springfield itself remained haunted by their absence. And yet, despite the frustration, despite the decades of dead ends, hope endured. Detectives believed the case could still be solved. Families believed the truth could still come to light. And the community believed that closure was still possible, even after so many years. The mystery of the Springfield Three was not just about who took them or why. It was about resilience, about the refusal to let their story fade, and about the determination to seek answers no matter how much time passed. Decades have passed since that quiet June night in Springfield, Missouri. The world has changed in countless ways. Technology has advanced, social media has transformed the way stories are shared, and true crime has become a global cultural phenomenon. And yet, the case of the three missing women remains exactly where it began: unanswered. The Springfield Three are still missing. Their absence is still felt. And their story continues to echo through the community, the country, and the true crime world as one of the most haunting mysteries of modern times. The legacy of this case is complex. On one level, it is a story of heartbreak, of families left without answers, and of a community forever changed. But on another, it is a story about resilience, determination, and the refusal to let three women be forgotten. For law enforcement, the case became a landmark study in both challenges and lessons. Detectives, police recruits, and criminal justice students have examined the investigation for decades, analyzing what went wrong and what might have been done differently. The compromised crime scene, the deleted phone messages, the lost opportunity to preserve evidence. These became cautionary examples, underscoring the importance of immediate and meticulous procedure. The Springfield Three case is now cited in training manuals and academic discussions about missing persons investigations. It serves as a reminder of how fragile the window of opportunity can be in the early hours of a crime, and how even well-meaning actions can unintentionally alter the course of an investigation forever. The case also revealed the powerful role of media. At times, coverage helped amplify the search, ensuring national awareness and keeping the women's faces in the public eye. But it also created challenges, flooding investigators with false leads, spreading rumors, and at times overshadowing facts with speculation. The delicate balance between transparency and investigative integrity became one of the defining features of the case. For Springfield residents, the story became woven into the fabric of the city. Even today, locals recall where they were when they first heard about the disappearance. They remember the vigils, the candlelight gatherings, and the sense of unease that settled over the community. Parents who were children at the time recall how their routines suddenly changed, how they were no longer allowed to walk home alone, how their parents began locking doors that had once been left open. The families of Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy have carried the heaviest burden of all. For them, time has not dulled the pain. Birthdays, anniversaries, and milestones are reminders of what was lost. Their courage in speaking out year after year has ensured the women's names never faded from memory. Even in the absence of closure, their advocacy has given the case endurance. In interviews, relatives have often described the experience as living in two worlds. In one world, there is hope that the women might still be found alive somewhere, somehow. In the other, there is the painful acceptance that the outcome may have been far more tragic. Straddling those two realities for decades has been one of the most profound challenges of their lives. The Springfield Three also left an enduring mark on the true crime community. Their story has been told in documentaries, podcasts, books, and countless online discussions. Each retelling introduces the case to new audiences, keeping the mystery alive and ensuring that someone, somewhere, might notice a detail others have missed. The case resonates because it touches on primal fears, the idea that people can disappear without a trace, that danger can strike in the most ordinary places, and that safety is never absolute. It also resonates because it defies resolution. Unlike many stories that end with arrests, trials, and answers, this one remains open-ended. That open ending is what keeps the Springfield Three at the forefront of true crime discussions, even decades later. For law enforcement, the story is also one of persistence. The files remain open. Detectives continue to review tips, no matter how much time has passed. Advances in technology hold the promise of new opportunities. For example, DNA techniques that were unavailable in the early 1990s could, if new evidence ever surfaces, provide answers in ways once unimaginable. Cold case investigators often describe their work as planting seeds. A case may remain dormant for years, but one new discovery, one technological advancement, or one person finally coming forward can change everything. The Springfield Three remain a priority in that sense. Unsolved but never forgotten. The women themselves have become symbols, not of tragedy but of humanity. Sherrill is remembered as a hard-working mother, a woman devoted to her daughter and her career. Suzie is remembered as vibrant, strong-willed, and full of plans for the future. Stacy is remembered as kind, thoughtful, and grounded, on the verge of stepping into adulthood with excitement and promise. They were not just victims or mysteries. They were people with lives, dreams, and families who loved them deeply. Remembering them as more than a case file is one of the most important legacies of this story. Over the years, memorials and vigils have continued. Each June, people gather to light candles and speak their names, ensuring that the passage of time does not erase them. Their photographs remain visible in Springfield, symbols of resilience, reminders of an unanswered question that still matters. The community has also found ways to channel the tragedy into something constructive. Awareness campaigns about personal safety, community vigilance, and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior have grown out of the lessons of 1992. Springfield has become more cautious, more aware, and in some ways more connected because of the shared experience of loss. What makes the Springfield Three case so enduring is its lack of resolution. Human beings crave answers. We want stories to have beginnings, middles, and ends. But some stories like this one resist closure. And in that resistance, they become part of cultural memory. They become stories that are told again and again, not because they are solved, but because they are not. The Springfield Three remind us that behind every unsolved case are real people whose lives were interrupted, real families left with unhealed wounds, and real communities forever changed. They remind us of the importance of justice, the value of persistence, and the need to never give up, even when the trail seems cold. As of today, the case remains unsolved. The Springfield Police Department continues to treat it as active. Tips are still welcomed. Hope still lingers. Somewhere out there the truth exists. And perhaps one day, with the right discovery, the right technology, or the right confession, the silence of June 7, 1992, will finally be broken. Until then, the story of the Springfield Three remains what it has always been. A mystery with no clues, a wound with no closure, and a reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, the extraordinary can happen.